So welcome to this Blogging Heads discussion on climate change. My name is Neil Bhatiya. I'm a policy associate at the Century Foundation, a nonpartisan progressive think tank. And joining me today is Tim Kovach. Tim, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Tim Kovach. I'm an independent analyst and blogger who focuses on climate change, environmental security, disasters, all of those types of issues.
So we did one of these a few months ago, Tim, and we promised folks that when the new Congress came in, there'd be a lot more issues to discuss. So here we are, and I think sort of the natural place to start would be the Senate's debate and then upcoming vote on Keystone XL. And for those of you who have been living under a rock for 5 years, the Keystone XL is a proposed extension to an existing set of pipeline infrastructure that is meant to bring tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, down to refineries in the lower Midwest, particularly in Texas. And it's essentially a shortcut to what is there now that's meant to resolve a bottleneck of oil production that's been building up over the last 5 years or so. And the political fight over this centers around the fact that since the pipeline crosses the U.S.-Canadian border, the State Department has to approve it, and part of that approval process has been delayed by the Obama administration for various reasons that we can get into. And over the, let's say, 4 years or so since the permitting process began, it's become a lightning rod for the environmental movement here in the United States, with groups like 350.org and Bill McKibben and James Hansen, and more established organizations like Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, NRDC, have sort of had a renaissance of organizing and political activism in opposition to Keystone XL. I think we can say that this is one of the most motivated, organized periods for the environmental movement in an awful long time. And I think one of the things that we should discuss is sort of whether that is in the aggregate the best thing for a movement to focus on sort of one particular infrastructure project. I care about the environment and climate change, but I go back and forth in terms of believing whether Keystone will be, as many have said, a game over for the climate in the way that the activists like to talk about. Maybe that just means I'm sort of a staid incrementalist and not a bomb thrower. So, I'm wondering what you think. Convince me that this is something that is indeed a do or die moment for fighting climate change.
Sure. So I'll start by prefacing by saying that I've been kind of, on the fringes of the Keystone fight, dating all the way back to 2011. When I moved to DC back in 2011, was right when the 350 action was starting. And so I went to a lot of those rallies and kind of bought into the logic of Keystone and the Keystone fight. And I'll be the first person to acknowledge that even though I definitely have a horse in this race, I can understand why a lot of people who are, even those who like you, are interested in climate change and want to see action and feel that this is an important issue, are not necessarily sold on Keystone as being kind of, I guess, the keystone, for lack of a better term, of this climate movement. People who would much rather see some sort of comprehensive policy development as opposed to some sort of activist movement to fight the system, if you will. But I think that the important thing to understand is that, in our current political structure, it's so incredibly difficult to get any meaningful energy or climate policy developed. we had the ACES bill, the American Climate and Energy Act, that got through Congress, that got through the House back in 2009, and that died before it even got to the Senate floor. And since then, we really have had nothing done congressionally. We've had some things, so obviously some great things done by President Obama, and some very, very minor incremental action. But even the bipartisan bill, the Shaheen-Portman Energy Efficiency Act, can't get through the current Congress, even though it should be a no-brainer, because basically all it does is set standards for government buildings. So I think we need to understand that there's a very strong opposition to any action on climate within the current Congress. And I think Dave Roberts has pointed this out, that the best thing we can do if you're interested in climate change is to try to actually push back against that with a movement of our own. And for whatever reason, Keystone became the lightning rod that the movement was built around. And I think we can go back and second guess whether or not Keystone was the right thing to do, whether or not Keystone was the best option. People have pointed out that it's only that's less than 1% of total emissions, even if you look at what the State Department says, if you count the emissions from the oil that would flow through it. But the fact of the matter is, Keystone is the fight that we have. It's the fight that we've had for going on 6 years now, and it seems to be working. There was a report that came out a few months ago from a shop actually here in Cleveland, the Institute for Energy Economics, International. I can't remember exactly what it stands for.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. They're gonna hate me if they see this.
We can do it in post production. We'll edit it in post production.
But they did a report with Oil Change International that looked at the effects of market forces and of political opposition to tar sands development. And what they found is that the combination of those two have deprived tar sands producers of over $30 billion in market share since 2010. And over half of that, $17 billion, according to this report, is directly due to the political opposition that has developed around Keystone and the other pipelines. And so I think that the important thing to look at is, on the aggregate, what Keystone has helped to do in terms of developing a climate change movement. We now have opposition developing to fossil fuel projects all over the country. There's supposed to be 3 other tar sands pipelines that are running through Canada, and those are now being fought by provincial governments in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, as well as very much so by the First Nations movement that has developed in Canada, with the resistance that has formed around various issues that have affected First Nations over the years. There's fights over coal export terminals in the Pacific Northwest. Really, the number one thing right now, coal has seen its market share basically plummet in the past few years. The price of coal, similar, I guess, to the price of oil in the past few months, has dropped by more than 50% since 2010. And really, coal's best option to try to get itself back on firmer footing is to export to Asia, where it's going to fetch a higher price. Instead of $40 per ton, it's going to be able to go over $100 per ton. But in order to do that, the cheapest way to get that coal to Asia is, because it's mostly mined in the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, is to ship it to the Pacific Northwest and then be taken by carrier over the ocean to Asia. But to do that, you need these specialized coal export terminals, and there's been a really strong movement that has developed basically out of the Keystone fight that has knocked the vast majority of these export terminals offline, and made it extremely difficult for them for the coal industry to have any chance of being able to really ramp up production and for export. And so I think we need to look at the Keystone movement not necessarily just on the merits of the pipeline alone, but in terms of the holistic sense of what it has done for the climate action movement. And I guess there was a piece that I really subscribed to that was in Inside Climate News last week, which basically said that in absence of a comprehensive energy policy, infrastructure projects count as energy policy. So Joe Biden often gets quoted for saying, "Don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget and I'll tell you what your values are."
Right.
And we haven't had an energy policy passed in this country since the 2007 Energy Security Act. And a lot of that has since been rolled back. If you look at what got done in the Cromnibus bill in December with rolling back the light bulb standards. And so, in lieu of having some sort of comprehensive energy action that gets through Congress, which I don't see happening anytime soon, taking on these one-off projects really does amount to energy policy, in my view.
Sure. So, I mean, there are several things that I'll sort of say in response to that. I mean, I do want an active climate movement, and I am sort of willing to put up with playing down a lot of the nuance of these things, even if, as an analyst, I recognize that some things that people are saying are just simply not true, and that it's, that part of wanting a responsible government and responsible policy is having it based on the facts and not emotion, even though politics is, to a great extent, about people's emotions and people's values. And so there's an inherent tension there that, a pipeline is the physical manifestation of the fossil fuel industry. And so it's a really easy decision to make to say that this is where we're going to draw the line, that there's something that you can point to that will go through people's neighborhoods, that will
a literal line in the sand.
A literal line in the sand, tar sands to be specific. But I mean, how do you think the climate movement, regardless of what the ultimate disposition of Keystone is, I mean, where do they go from here in terms of supporting smart climate policy in the U.S.? Because, I mean, since 2011, I think the Obama administration in particular has spearheaded a sea change in how they look at climate policy. They recognize, as you do, as I do, as anyone who looks at this objectively, is that the current Congress, both Republicans and not an insignificant number of Democrats, aren't interested in legislative policy that tackles climate change. And so now everything has to go through executive action. So you are actually seeing significant things like the EPA Clean Power Plan, which is meant to regulate emissions state by state from current power plants. You have rules for new power plants, which, for all intents and purposes, makes it uneconomic to build new coal-burning infrastructure in this country, at least. You have things like the recently announced regulations on methane emissions, which we can talk a little bit about because, I have some problems with the way that the rule has been issued, and others in the environmental movement do as well. And you also have, on the international side, sort of a more active U.S. engagement with both the UN process and bilaterally, which we will talk about in a little bit. But I mean, how does a movement go from something that's so tightly focused to try to defend something that is much more, disparate? How do you defend, 5,000 pages of Environmental Protection Agency regulations in a way that is as emotionally compelling as the pipeline is?
Sure.
And I mean, is the movement that's been built up around Keystone, is that deployable in a way where, say, state legislatures around the country who plan to obstruct the EPA power plan, are they going to feel enough political pressure where that's something that's not sustainable and popular, and that they'll back down from?
Sure. I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you brought that up, and that's a very important question. I guess I see it twofold, and whether or not this is a satisfactory answer, you can let me know. But on the first side of things, on the first side of the equation, from kind of the activist viewpoint, I think that there has actually been built out of this movement that coalesced around Keystone. There's actually tried the environmental movement that is built around this has actually tried to use that coalition to try to do some positive change as well. And so I can't tell you the number of emails I get, and I'm sure that you get on a daily basis saying, sign this Sierra Club petition, sign this NRDC petition in support of the Clean Power Plan, in support of the EPA's new surface water rule, in support of the Obama administration's methane regulations, ozone regulations, whatever it may be. One thing about the environmental movement, and it writ large, that is reflected as well in the Keystone movement, is the fact that it's to its credit, there's so many organizations, they all realize that they have a distinct role to play. So you used the term bomb throwers before. I guess that would be the 350 Credo side of the equation. They're the ones out there, the activists on the front line, shaking the bus, trying to get the attention. And I agree with you. There's certainly things that 350 has done and said and written in the past that I did not agree with, that I rolled my eyes at. I'm just like, that's not, you guys are exaggerating or losing sight of the larger picture. But at the same time, we have those on the outside kind of challenging and riling up the system. But you also have the people fighting from within to do that sort of thing. The Environmental Defense Fund, the NRDCs of the world, who are meeting with the EPA, sitting down with the members of the Obama administration, working on
much to the chagrin of congressional Republicans.
Absolutely, and I think that's
they don't think the EPA should talk to environmentalists about the environment.
Right. But so I do think that they have attempted to capitalize this movement against something, against Keystone, against fossil fuel infrastructure, and turn it into a movement for something, a movement for climate action. And so I think that movement started back in probably 2013 when they had the Climate Forward rally in D.C. that I went to, that was estimated to anywhere of 30 to 40,000 people. And then that really pushed forward into the rally that happened in September of last year. And I know that I think you were there because it was in New York, but that was a strange.
So that people don't think I'm too conservative, I did march in the climate march in September. So I do get out there and pound the pavement from time to time.
That was a strange collection of every issue under the sun, but there was an attempt to actually say, we're not just against things. We want you to do something, and here's what we're interested in, and here's what we're looking for. Right. The other thing that has built out of Keystone that I think is the other tack that you need to take is actual political action from within the halls of the legislature. And so Keystone appears to have been the linchpin that got people like Tom Steyer and these other big funders into play on climate action. And so you saw in the midterm election, unfortunately, it wasn't terribly successful, but you saw that the environmental movement and climate change people specifically spent more money in the November midterm elections than they've ever spent before. They were they weren't able to match one for one the dollars coming from the fossil fuel industry, but they were able to punch above their weight class that they've been fighting in the past.
Right. And
it wasn't just happening in Congress; it was happening at the state level as well. So Tom Steyer lost a lot of the races that he put his money in for Senate. In particular, he kind of got crushed in the Senate. But he also spent a lot of money at the state level, especially in Washington, trying to get some state senators elected in Washington who would support Governor Inslee's attempts on climate action. And so there was a lot more success working that tactic. And so I think it's this twofold movement that needs to develop out of Keystone. One, to support the positive actions that you mentioned that are mostly coming out from the Obama administration as a result of executive action. The other being to get people motivated, to get people on the ground, to kind of harness this Obama 2008 groundswell into fighting for climate change in the halls of the legislatures as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Whether or not that pays off, and I live in Ohio, and Ohio is one of the states that is kind of ground zero for dealing with the obstructionism that you mentioned at the state level. We rolled back our clean energy standards. Our attorney general is suing the EPA over the Clean Power Plan, and so it remains to see whether that happens. But I think those are the two things that have to evolve out of Keystone, and that are evolving out of Keystone.
Yeah, no, and I'm hoping that is the case because, there are sort of bigger fish to fry than one pipeline, and it'll be interesting to see how the movement sort of adapts strategy and adapts tactics in the face of that, especially at the state level. You and I, the last time we did this, we spoke about state opposition that with respect to the Clean Power Plan, that you might have a situation that looks a lot like the Medicaid expansion out of Obamacare, where there are some states that go along with what the administration has outlined, and then there are states that don't, and they will either pursue legal relief to stop the rules or pursue a variety of other tactics, including, who knows what they might try to do in Congress to to roll that back. But I mean, you'll have essentially two trajectories of states where there are ones that come up with very compelling plans, like the Governor Inslee's plan, or what California has done in terms of their emissions trading plan, and then what Governor Brown has announced in terms of radically upscaling the percentage that California is going to get from renewable and non-fossil fuel sources. So I think, there's a lot going on at the state level that will be interesting. So I want to sort of wrap up the Keystone discussion with sort of a hypothetical. I think President Obama's standard for approval or disapproval of the Keystone pipeline for the last few years has been whether it contributes substantially to global warming, compared to some other alternative scenario where the pipeline's not built, but maybe tar sands is still produced, and people have tried to read the tea leaves as to whether or not he'll actually approve this in the end. If I had to bet money, I'd say that he will end up rejecting it, actually. But if the opposite case is true, where after all this hemming and hawing, it is by some chance approved by the State Department, and the administration makes the argument that there are enough countervailing forces, including low global oil prices, where you're not going to see substantially increased emissions from oil delivered by Keystone XL. What do you think this does to his legacy as an environmental leader? Because as it stands now, I think he's one of the most consequential environmental presidents we've ever had, outside of either Teddy Roosevelt or the reluctant environmentalist Richard Nixon. who let things like the EPA and Clean Air and Clean Water Act happen because he was content to let Congress do those things while he focused on foreign policy, and as a result, he's credited with something that's pretty substantial. To what extent do you think that a Keystone approval would tarnish things like the EPA or what he's done with China, for example?
To be fair to President Obama, and I think you made the case quite succinctly, that he has done more on environmental issues than basically any president. Obviously, given the nature of the times that we're in, he's done more on climate change than every other president combined, basically. So I would hope that if unfortunately, if he did approve Keystone, which I believe that, as you do, that I don't think he will, given the current state of affairs. I used to think he would, but now I don't think he will. I would hope that the environmental movement that is built up around Keystone would get over the initial shock and the initial anger that developed around this, and eventually be able to take a step back and see what the president has done, and continue to support the actions that he's already undertaken and those that he hopes to continue to take in the future. Because if we just make Keystone the be all end all and say that this is the president's line in the sand, and if he doesn't go our way, then we're done with him, then we're really going to be doing ourselves a disservice, because there's a lot of important fights that we have coming up, whether it be obviously on the Clean Power Plan, on the Paris Accord that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, on future regulations, including the U.S.-China agreement that they reached last year that we're going to talk here a little bit, where if the president doesn't have the support of this coalition that is built up that has been backing into this point, it's going to be a whole lot harder for him to be able to get these things done. And
Right.
so
especially since he only has 2 years left.
Exactly. So if we can be mad and we can piss and moan all we want, but eventually they're going to have to pick themselves up and actually do something about it, because if we don't, we're only going to be harming ourselves.
No, I think I would tend to agree with that, and my hope would be that whatever anger there is, and I do expect some, obviously, that it would dissipate over time as sort of people sober up about what he's done and what the future holds. In 2016, who knows? It's a long time away in terms of what kind of environmental president the next man or woman will be, and what their sort of perspective on all these issues is.
I guess before we change, just kind of quickly, not so that we don't get too much bogged down in the weeds with Keystone and forget and everything else. I'm wondering what your view is on how the plunge in oil prices might affect the president's decision on this.
I mean, politically, it will probably make it a little bit easier to say no. I mean, I think if you look at the break-even prices for tar sands production, it's not quite the same as it is for most sort of freewheeling fracking operations. A lot of the money is invested up front and then can be amortized over a long period of time, even with lower prices. So, I mean, if Keystone is built, I think there will still be tar sands oil produced. I just don't think it will be as much under the current price conditions that you're looking at than if Keystone had been built in 2011 or 2012, when the price of oil was significantly higher. So if that demand is and the resultant production is reduced, I think it robs the pipeline of a lot of its economic benefits. Not all. I mean, you can make the argument that, of course, that a pipeline is safer than shipping oil by rail, and that you get sort of a safety dividend from having the pipeline instead. But I think, I mean, the tar sands producers themselves, of course, they say they still want the pipeline regardless of what the price is, because their business model is now almost completely dependent on getting that access. But I think it would make it slightly easier on the president to say that this is not something we actually need anymore, because there's now a global oil supply glut, and delivering that much more from Alberta doesn't really help the United States. He's hinted a couple times that it doesn't, this is Canadian oil, not U.S. oil, and so maybe we shouldn't be as concerned about it, which is odd considering it does pass through North Dakota and is supposed to pick up some crude from the fields there.
Bakken.
Bakken. But I mean, in the aggregate, it's it's Canadian, which is sort of an odd sort of perspective to take. But whatever. So I mean, speaking of international relations, I think we can move on now to the United Nations process to fighting climate change. So we're going to shift from something that's hyper-local to something that's global. This December, the UN FCCC process had its Conference of Parties in Lima, Peru, and this is sort of one of the big precursor conferences to what's supposed to happen in Paris in December of this year, where everyone is supposed to come to an agreement about something that will replace Kyoto. And so this was, I would say, a pretty interesting development in the sort of UN process. It went down past the last minute. They had to extend a couple of days to get something through.
Don't they always?
But credit the the U.S. sort of negotiators credit people who stuck it out, and we do have now something that we've never had before, and that's at least a rhetorical commitment by everybody to come up with some kind of emissions reductions plan. So under the old, Kyoto framework, if you were a developing world nation, that was not something that you were required to do. That was only something that countries like the United States and Europe and Japan had to have, a national emissions reduction plan that would hopefully, under some scenario, keep us 2 degrees Celsius below, under 2 degrees Celsius from, under 2 degrees Celsius rise, from pre-industrial levels. And now, so what's supposed to happen, on paper at least, between now and I think it's March, April, May timeframe, is that countries are supposed to have their sort of intended national, the INDCs. What does that acronym mean? The intended national.
Oh God, I can't remember. Something.
Not individual or intended
national determined commitments. Individually
determined commitments.
Yeah. Something like that.
I've been calling it INDC. I've been calling it INDC so often without knowing or without remembering what the thing means. But so everyone is supposed to come up with a plan to reduce emissions. So speaking of the environmental movement, on the one hand, I think they're glad that there was an agreement out of Lima at all. But on the other hand, they're sort of disappointed that, again, it's not something that's sort of binding in any way. It's not, we're not at a treaty yet, and no one, I think, even envisions that we'll have a treaty, that it'll be sort of a gentleman's and gentle ladies agreement among the nations of the world, that this would, that everyone would have a plan, and that if you added up all the plans together, you would get the emissions reductions you need to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And so, wondering your reactions to Lima writ large, to sort of this non-binding pathway towards emissions reductions, and whether you think sort of norm shifting alone is something that we can really rely on to get to where we need to be.
Sure. So I think this is Lima and Paris, by extension, are kind of one place where I definitely diverge from the mainstream environmental movement of the U.S., especially the one that built around Keystone, because I don't think that on paper the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, is supposed to be the international body that's going to deal with climate change. But I think if you actually look at the treaty that set it up and the way that the body works, it can never be the institution that solves climate change. It just can't. No single institution can ever solve climate change. It has to be done, a million actions taking place at a million different places at the same time, in perpetuity. And so I'm actually pleased with what developed out of Lima. I understand it's kind of a weak agreement, and Paris is going to be a weak agreement as well. But at the same time, you have to understand that when you're dealing with 196 sovereign countries, if you try to get something through that's legally binding, that requires action, that has all of these shall, will, must statements, it's going to end up boiling down to the least common denominator. Right. So if you look at Kyoto we tried that tack with Kyoto. And so we got this agreement that said the Annex 1 countries, the OECD countries plus Israel, must agree to reduce their emissions versus 1990 levels. What you saw out of Kyoto is that, one, the U.S. never ratified it. Two, the multiple countries who did sign on to it didn't meet their commitments and either just got away with it or withdrew from the commitment entirely. And includes Russia,
Japan, for example, Canada,
Russia. I think New Zealand withdrew. Australia was not coming anywhere near meeting its requirements.
Right.
And even if everyone did meet their requirements, we would have seen a reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions by 5% versus 1990 levels, which is not exactly a remarkable achievement. And
No.
we actually,
I mean, to put that in perspective, there was a recent report looking at decarbonization rates to avoid that 2-degree limit, and we'd have to go, zero carbon or even net negative carbon, actually trying to suck some of what we've emitted out of the atmosphere by the end of this century. And there's no currently identified pathway that anyone is advocating for outside the realm of academic hypotheticals that would actually get us there.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess I don't see value in trying to pursue that same path that we did with Kyoto, because it's just going to lead to another weak sauce agreement that doesn't get the job done and that makes everybody mad. And furthermore, it won't get ratified by the U.S. Senate, so the U.S. won't even be involved in it. And so I give a lot of credit. I believe it was New Zealand who came up with this idea, and so I give a lot of credit to New Zealand and to the U.S. negotiating team under Todd Stern for being able to go into Lima and say, here's what we can do. We can do things through executive action. We're already parties to the UNFCCC treaty from 1992, and therefore we
so we don't need to ratify anything by the Senate because the superseding agreement has been in effect since then. Mm-hmm. So,
and so
no follow-on treaty is necessary. Yeah,
and the president can do this through his own executive action. And so what you get is, for the first time in history, you have, this body's been together for 23 years now. You get the first time in history that all 196 parties have said, we will cut emissions. We pledge to do something. The treaty, the one thing that you have to look at in all of these UN treaties is the language that they use. Is it may or must? Is it shall or should? And it says all parties will agree to do more than they're currently doing. And so that's a big step. Everybody from Kiribati all the way up to China and the U.S., everybody has to do something more than they're doing now. And but it also sticks to the original principle of the document, which was that there were these common but differentiated responsibilities. So it understood that the main developed countries like the U.S., the UK, the rest of the European Union, all had a much larger stake in causing the climate crisis than the small island states or India or Pakistan or sub-Saharan Africa. And so those countries who caused the problem would be the ones who had to respond. And that is still enshrined in Lima, and that's going to stay in Paris. But it says everybody has to do something, but we understand that you all have your own domestic issues. We understand you all have your own levels of development. We understand that there's politics at play that most people seem to ignore outside of the U.S., and so we're going to let you do what you can do, and then we're going to just demand that you keep doing more after you do that. And so I wish that this was the agreement they had reached 20 years ago, because if they had reached this agreement 20 years ago, we'd probably be well on our way to getting the job done. That said, we didn't reach this agreement 20 years ago, so I don't know that it's going to be enough, but it's at least a start. And so I guess in that regard, I'm pretty optimistic about it, although I know that it's not the mechanism that's going to get the job done ultimately.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting, too, that there have been developments outside the UN process that have also raised optimism. So in late November, President Obama went to Beijing, and what was the culmination of essentially a year's worth of full court diplomatic press by the U.S. with the Chinese was sort of a bilateral understanding between the two countries, whereby, we would, as you said, the perspective that the UN process is now taking is that we would do more than what we had originally promised, in terms of now a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions by 2025 versus the 2005 reference, which was more sort of ambitious than even what the aggregate of the EPA Clean Power Plan was meant to put us at. And that the Chinese, in turn, are finally saying, after years of not wanting to say this, is that, whatever their emissions in 2030 will be, that will be the peak. That, they will develop their economy and they will reach this inflection point, and then from then on, they will actually reduce emissions. And this was, I think, pretty surprising to many people that the U.S. had gotten the Chinese to actually put this down on paper. After, they were one of the original Annex II countries. The Kyoto Protocol didn't apply to them because they were still considered developing world. They still had millions of people living in poverty, and adopting aggressive emissions reductions under that scenario was politically unpalatable. Flash forward 15 years, now they're saying that, through this agreement, I think they're saying that they're fairly confident that they can get to a slightly higher emissions level than they are now, but then sort of throw the entire engine into reverse and say that, we have the technology and the money, importantly, and then most critically, the political will to force these changes and to sort of reorient the entire trajectory of the Chinese economy to be sort of a responsible member of the global community when it comes to trying to fight climate change. Mm-hmm. And a significant part of this agreement, in addition to the peak emissions year, was a promise to increase their own share of non-fossil fuel energy to, I believe, 20%, which would effectively double what they have now and would add more non-fossil fuel to their energy mix than the U.S. currently has total.
Right.
So it's a pretty substantial promise. It's built on sort of the bedrock of a lot of diplomatic cooperation between the U.S. and the Chinese on clean energy, cooperation, research and development, trying to sort of avoid an all-out trade war when it comes to solar subsidies, and protecting sort of intellectual property. But I think, if you had to rank things that happened last year, I would say this is probably the most important development we've seen on the international side of the climate equation. Certainly, probably since the UNFCCC was first founded back in the early 90s.
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of blowback. Initially people said this was a game changer and this was a huge deal, and then there was the blowback to that, which said, well, if you actually look at the agreement, this is pretty weak. China will already be on course to reduce to reach that carbon cap and start reducing emissions by 2030, doing exactly what it's doing right now. So this is just basically giving them a pat on the back for whatever they were already doing. But then I think a lot of people went back in and took another look at the agreement, and I think there's a few things that came out of it that we should really give both parties credit for. One is that I don't think without this agreement being reached in November, we would have gotten the agreement that we got out of Lima. That was the process we were going to take regardless, but this really jump-started it. And without the U.S. and China, the two biggest players in the room, being able to sit down at a table and say, we're going to do this together, I'm not sure you would have been able to get the rest of the developing world on board.
Right. And I wrote in November, shortly after this happened, that, one of the main consequences of the U.S.-China agreement would be putting an incredible amount of normative pressure on India to accelerate what it's willing to do. And the Indians haven't said explicitly what their nationally determined contribution would be. They plan to announce that in the springtime. But I think there's no way that what they're going to announce would have been what they would have announced in the absence of a U.S.-China agreement. I think they would have been happy with what they've been saying for years, is that they're still a poor country, and to expect them to reduce emissions is unfair, and is emblematic of the arrogance of the West, who's built their economic development on the back of dirty fossil fuels for generations, and we have the right to develop our economy as well. I think that's sort of, it's been a little bit crumbling for a while in terms of the credibility of that argument, especially from other developing world nations who have said that India's gotten rich over the past 20 years, and that this is a ridiculous thing to say if you're somebody from Bangladesh looking at India in terms of different levels of economic growth and emissions responsibility. So I think that's a knock-on effect of the U.S.-China accord or agreement, or whatever you want to call it, is that it puts the Indians in a position where they now have to be a little bit more ambitious and follow through on things in a way that I don't think they would have previously. And President Obama is traveling to India next week or the week after is for India's Republic Day.
Yeah.
And among the things that they'll be talking about again, as with the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, is clean energy cooperation. The U.S. has invested a lot in their relationship with the Indians in terms of trying to help them find a way where they can develop their own sort of capacity for deploying clean energy, in this case, particularly solar. From what people have been teasing, I don't think you'll see something like an announcement of a peak emissions year or anything like that from the Indians. I think this meeting will be a lot more low-key. Part of that is because the Indians might not know yet what they even want to do. But I think it's still, this is an opportunity to double down on a lot of what's been done recently and sort of move the relationship forward to the point where, in the future, the Indians feel compelled in many ways by the strength of the bilateral relationship to do more. Because I think, what you're seeing in the time since Copenhagen in 2009 is that I think nations are really coming around to the need for responsibility on this issue. And I think a lot of it is driven by local economics as much as it is by international norms, but I think the two things sort of work together. So in India, for example, the domestic Indian coal industry is a mess. This is a nation with some of the largest existing coal reserves worldwide, but they still have to import coal for their plants because none of it is allocated properly. And there's a huge corruption scandal dating back to the previous Indian government in terms of how coal is allocated, and there have been allegations of kickbacks and things. And the new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, wants to reform India's domestic coal industry, and they narrowly averted a huge strike over this question just this past week. And so I think part of the realization of these difficulties is that, if India wants to be self-sufficient in power, then it needs to invest in new sources. And so things like solar energy make a lot of sense in India for obvious reasons. And that this is something that on the local, state, and federal level in India, there's been a lot of movement, a lot of money and resources dedicated to this, that it's beneficial not only from a balance of payments perspective in terms of not having to pay for expensive imported fuel. It helps domestic Indian industry in terms of trying to build as much of the solar infrastructure themselves that they can without violating WTO regulations. And there's been a subsidy fight with the U.S. over that as well. But I think the general trend is to try to be more cooperative and more open. And I think, it's sort of a lot of these co-benefits that are things that are both business friendly in the aggregate and climate friendly. And I think that's part of sort of the millions of things that you mentioned that together will be what's necessary to avoid the worst warming effects that I think you'll see as the general trend for at least this sort of generation of effort in terms of fighting climate change.
Mm-hmm. I guess before switching gears, I know that we're starting to run up against time. Just say like one or two more things about the agreement, and then I want to ask you a short question.
Sure.
So I know that there was some pushback that as I mentioned, that this agreement wasn't substantial, but I did see a report that came out when when Carbon Tracker analyzed it that said that if the U.S. and China fully implement this agreement, it would reduce global carbon emissions by 639 gigatons through 2100. And they pointed out that that's more than all global carbon emissions from 1990 to 2013 combined. Right. So that's a pretty big deal. And this deal alone would decrease potential warming by 0.19 degrees Celsius, which is not insignificant. That's almost a quarter of the warming we've seen since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to this point. Right. And then the other thing is that China has actually, to China's credit, they've actually already apparently started to reduce their dependence on coal. From 2000 to 2010, coal demand grew by 10% a year, but then last year it apparently decreased by 2.5%.
And right. So I think they've announced their intention at least to stop importing it at some point. I don't know if they've yet identified the time horizon for that. Mm-hmm. But that's at least something that they're willing to look at. And again, this sort of, to borrow a phrase from the early part of the century, when you have coalitions of the willing that are big and that are sort of dedicated and have the financial resources to realize that, it actually gets you more of the way to where you need to be than one might think. When you read stories about problems at international conferences like NEMA, that there is indeed a lot going on behind the scenes that is actually quite beneficial.
I think a lot of the pushback that has led China to make this agreement and to cut its coal demand has been born out of what they call China's air apocalypse, the horrible air pollution that they see in most of the country's large cities, especially Beijing. But interestingly enough, there was a report that came out at the end of last year that looked at particulate matter pollution, smog pollution, and they found that the 13 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are actually located in India. None of them are in China. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think that if there's that public pressure building up on Modi and the Indian government that we've seen in China, and you think that's going to help push the Indian government towards taking some sort of action.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the same level of anger has been organized in the way that we've seen in China, in India, at least as of yet, which is sort of ironic considering that one is a democracy and one isn't. Right. But there've been more protests and more anger in the streets in China than there have been in India. The exact reasons for that, I could only really speculate. Mm-hmm. I think, part of it is that it's a quite recent phenomenon that, you have a growing urban population and the amount of coal that is actually being used is quite significant, and that, even within 5 years, it's not something that you would have seen, but you are seeing now, and I think it's only just coalescing into something that Indian civil society can organize around, and part of the reason is that, another reason is that the Indian government has, not shied away from pushing around NGOs, in particular Greenpeace, most recently, especially if they suspect or know that these organizations have received foreign funding. So I think the threat of government sort of suppression and interference, you can probably ascribe that to the reason you're not seeing, I think, the activism that you may see in a few years' time.
Right, and I've written about this in the past. I also think that there's a lot of evidence that in authoritarian regimes, more so than in democracies, the environment becomes a convenient way for people to protest issues with their government because it's less it's less political in nature and it's less potentially threatening to the regime than talking about democracy. And you've seen that, and the same doesn't necessarily hold in India because they have the freedom to mobilize and they have the freedom to argue about so many other issues.
Right. So I think we're almost done. I think we'll sort of wrap up with one thing we were asked to look at when preparing for this, and that is, I think, sort of the unique ability of the climate denial and climate skeptic movement to thrive in the United States. I think if you look at the polling that Yale has done, the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication has done on this, I think Americans' belief in global warming and the fact that humans cause it, it averages around the mid-60s. I think it topped out at around 70% in 2006 or 2007, and then it's dipped a little bit, and then it's sort of oscillated between 62 and 64% around that. And so that leaves a pretty sizable number of the population that either denies it outright or is not sure for whatever reason. And so it's sort of remained like there's a 20% group that is almost impervious to contrary evidence on this point, that refuses to believe what the scientific consensus says about it, that what professional scientific societies in the U.S. say about it. They don't even believe Bill Nye the Science Guy, and that's a real tragedy. So I've read a lot of theories about why this is, and I'd be interested in what your thoughts are in terms of, does climate denial exist because it's funded by people who benefit from the lack of climate action? Is it the lack of public scientific knowledge writ large, like the anti-vaccination movement in this country? Is it completely partisan motivated reasoning? I mean, what do you think's going on here?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all of those three, but where I typically end up coming down on is the last thing you mentioned, which is motivated reasoning. You'll see that, as you mentioned, there's that 20% of people who are just firmly set in their ways and have no interest in accepting the scientific consensus around climate change. And I'm sure we'll see some of them in the comments. So hi, commenters, how are you doing? The thing that you see is there was a study that came out last year, and it really solidified this, is that it has to do less with the science, less with with whether or not you've been exposed to it, than it does with what your political beliefs are and what the policy outcomes are of climate change.
Right.
And so, if you're a small government conservative, a libertarian, and you see a problem like climate change that's going to require some supranational approach, it's going to require government spending, it's going to require investment, it's going to require acknowledging the value of future generations relative to our own, that threatens your very core ideology. And so at that point, why would you want to buy into that if it's going to completely upend the way that you view the world, upend your status quo? And so therefore, you tend to digest and read the types of studies and types of information that further solidifies your existing view, and that's what is motivated reasoning. And to be fair to people who don't subscribe to climate change, and be fair to conservatives, liberals and progressives are just as susceptible to it as they are, and you'll see that type of thing. You know, I try to be as rational as I can around genetically modified organisms, but I still have that knee-jerk reaction, like, you're screwing with nature.
Yeah.
And I do my best to fight that, but I have to understand that I'm just as susceptible to motivated reasoning as anyone else is. But I think I'll read a brief statement on this that was in a piece that Dave Roberts wrote a few weeks ago, and it was that. So climate hawks are. This was a piece on why you're interested in fighting climate change. If you're a climate hawk, as they call us, you're most likely going to end up being a liberal. And so it's quote. So climate hawks are liberals. Against nationalism, they believe that the interests of every human being, even those geographically and temporally distant, matter. Against oligarchy, they believe that people can be organized into a political force that produces reform. Against libertarianism, that government can be used as an effective tool of collective action. Against small government fetishism, that enormous public investments are necessary to vouchsafe a sustainable future. Against American exceptionalism, that America owes a debt of leadership on a problem it did so much to create. End quote. And so you can really see how, if that's what the political outcome of this is, why you would be opposed to it, and that's fair. I can totally understand that. But I think that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Brad Plumer at Vox has a good piece on asking this question, whether there's a free market solution to climate change. And the only thing that really gets close to fitting that description would be, of course, a carbon tax. But if you're a small government conservative, any kind of tax is anathema to you. I think, it's sort of a very hard pill for many to swallow. And so, you sort of put on your ideological armor and you get into your camp and you sort of swing at anything that tries to come close to piercing that partisan veil.
Right. I've read a lot about this, and I've written a little bit about this. And the one thing that I've come down on is that that 20% of the population that we discussed, unfortunately, that seems to be the segment of the population that people who are fighting for climate change and are interested in climate science and defending it are focus the majority of their attention. A lot of it may be due to the fact that they're so well represented in our Congress. Most of the members, most of the chairs of the new committees in the Senate now firmly deny the science of climate change. There was just a study that said that 72% of congressional Republicans deny the science of climate change. Senator James Inhofe, who calls it the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, is now the head of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate. But I think what we need to do as people who are interested in actually tackling this issue that I consider to be the biggest issue we're facing right now is that we have to ignore them for a lack of a better option, because there's a much larger segment of the population, about half of people, who don't understand it, don't care about it, and are just generally indifferent towards it, or think it might be a big issue, but they're afraid of the policy outcomes. Right. And so a lot of the stuff that I've read said that, those are the people you need to be focusing on, because they can be persuaded. They can, if they're half of the population, if you can get half of the population on your side, you can accomplish a lot of things. And so what we need to do, and I think this is kind of where that I'm not a scientist trope has developed from, is that if you acknowledge that it's a problem, then you have to acknowledge that there's policy implications as well.
Yeah, you have to actually do something about it.
So there's this segment of the population that just doesn't want to pay attention to this problem, even if they might agree with the policy implications, or even if they might agree that it's an issue. And so what you have to do is go after them, explain the issue to them, and make it relevant for them. And the way to do that is not crying that it's the end of the world, and we have, because apparently this segment of the population tends to be a little fatalistic. So if you tell them that if we don't act, that we're all going to die, they're just going to immediately shut off and not do anything about it. So what I think we have to do is be reasonable, and to make climate change understandable to people by talking about how it affects you where you are right now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so I've tried, in Cleveland, I've tried to do this, talking about how it affects algae blooms in Lake Erie, or how it affects localized flooding issues, or how it's going to affect heat-related mortality. But it varies based on your location. And so I think that public health lens and how it affects your local environment and how it mixes in with all of the things going on around you is the only way that we can really get make any ground on this. And unfortunately, we just have to. I don't want to say that we have to write off 20% of the population because it makes me feel like an asshole, but we just can't devote so much time and energy on that, on dissuading them and trying to prove that they're wrong, because it's not going to work.
No, I think that's probably the sensible way to think about it. And I mean, I think if you look at a place like New York and the Hurricane Sandy experience, that's a powerful place to start with as well. And so it'll be interesting. You know, we started this with talking about what the environmental movement is going to do now and after Keystone, and I think part of it will be trying to figure out that sort of what a balanced approach looks to convincing people who are not yet quite on your side, but who are reachable in terms of getting them in the right place mentally to start thinking about solutions and approaches.
Right. And I think that type of movement can only be done at the grassroots because it has to be done everywhere at once.
Yeah. And so with that, I think we'll wrap up for this installment.
Yeah. Let's do it again.
Confident. Yeah, good to talk to you again, as always. I think at some point in the future, we'll have plenty to talk about as well to fill another hour. So hope to see you back here soon.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Neil. Take care.
Yep. Take care.